For our last video, we're going to just distinguish Aristotle from some modern ethical theories. In particular, we're going to be looking at Kant and Mill, and we're going to do this in a very abbreviated fashion to just get to the main points. But here's our sort of motivating focus question for this. What is more important in determining the rightness of an act? One's intentions or the consequences of the action? Right? So which do you think is more important? The intention someone has, whether someone has a good and bad intention in doing an act, or whether the act actually has good or bad consequences? Well, you can kind of make an argument for either side. For intentions, I mean, your intentions are really what you mean to do, right? And it seems to me that if you mean to do something good and it comes out good, great. If you mean to do something bad, it doesn't matter what its consequence is. If you meant to do something bad, how could that possibly be a right act if you meant to do something bad? On the other hand, consequences are really what's the actual outcome. It's what happens. If something good comes out of your act, to what extent does it really matter what you intended? If you end up helping a lot of people, who cares if that was in your intention or not, if it actually had the best outcome? So there's kind of two perspectives here, and they're both kind of attractive. To help you evaluate which one you think is more important, you can imagine a kind of chart, something like this, right? Where you could say we put consequences over here. We could say whether you had good or bad consequences, good or bad, in this case, intentions. Right? So you have to say, all right, let's say you had good consequences and a good intention. Well, clearly that's good. Good intentions, good consequences. Works out. If there was bad consequences and you had bad intentions, clearly that's a bad act, right? This is not good at all. But what about these two other situations? What if you had good consequences but a bad intention, right? Or compare that to this. What if you had a good intention, but you had bad consequences? Which would be a worse kind of moral situation? Which act is more right and which act is more wrong? Well, if you think that having a good intention but bad consequences is a better case scenario, then you kind of agree with this guy, Immanuel Kant. That in fact, what's most important is that you have the right kind of intention. We'll talk about what is the right intention for him. If you think that if there's good consequences, it doesn't really matter if you had a bad intention so much, then you sound like this guy, John Stuart Mill, who thinks that the most important thing is the consequences of an action. This kind of reveals to us a couple of different ethical theories. And so if we talk about ethical theories, we're talking about some type of theory that tries to explain why or how we make judgments about what is good or /right in action. I mean, it's about the kind of principles that we employ. What are the right principles that you use to make a judgment about what you should do, about what's good and what's right? And so there's several competing ethical theories. So we're going to talk about some of the most popular. So let's see, we'll make another thing here for ethical theories. One of the most important types of ethical theories that we might encounter is called consequentialism. Consequentialism is an ethical theory that says it's the consequences of your act that determine its rightness or wrongness. If you have good consequences, then it was a good act. If there was bad consequences, it was a bad act. And it's the consequences that reveal the totality of its rightness or wrongness. There's another ethical theory called Deontology. And this is a duty-based ethics. And in deontology, it's not primarily looking at, it doesn't in any way look at the consequence of an action. It looks at you having the right moral intention. And what is this right moral intention? That you will the moral law. Right? That you in doing the act, you will act in accordance with the moral law. Now, consequentialism was sort of started by Jeremy Bentham, and his particular proponent was our buddy John Stuart Mill, J.S. Mill. The deontology kind of has its real foundation, though it exists in lots of different forms, in our modern philosopher Immanuel Kant. Not Kant, but Kant. And in looking at these, there's so much to be said here, and we're not going to even begin to scratch the surface. But the key idea is this. Do the consequences reveal to you the rightness of an act, or is it your moral intention? And I think we need to take both of these kinds of views seriously. But even these two need to be distinguished from a third example, which is popular today, called virtue ethics. And of course, you might guess that the proponent in the beginnings of this idea of virtue ethics came in someone like Aristotle. Well, for Aristotle, the rightness of an act doesn't necessarily just consist in certain consequences or in particular intentions, but in virtue ethics, it has to do with being a virtuous, excellent person, and therefore being someone of good judgment. What Aristotle will recognize is that usually it's very complicated to really know what the best action is. You actually just need to be someone who has good judgment to sort of discover the rightness and wrongness of an act. So very briefly, without getting into these theories, because we clearly are just scratching the surface, let's just think of a couple of criticisms of each. Let's just say that you were a consequentialist with Mill. You said the rightness of an act comes from the kinds of consequences that come from the action. Well, here's probably a pretty good objection. One problem is, well, what are the consequences of an act? What are the consequences? How do you know what the consequences are? Well, one problem with trying to know what the consequences are is, first of all, the consequences are always in the past. In other words, the only way you can ever make a judgment about a consequences is looking at an act that had already occurred in the past and looking at the consequences that are in the past of that and continually making judgments about the past. The problem is, how do you make judgments about the future? How do you know what the consequences are going to be of your action? There's really no way of knowing exactly how things are going to unfold. And so you can't know in advance whether your act is good or bad because you can't possibly predict the future. And this, of course, leads itself to this problem that consequentialism frequently is descriptive, which is really not a separate issue, it's just an articulation of this, but it's descriptive versus being proscriptive. In other words, it can't tell you what to do, but it perhaps is just a way of describing whether someone's actions really were good or bad. So if you might consider, okay, deontology. Deontological ethics says, well, what is the moral law? Where does the moral law come from? Well, there's different kinds of deontology. And there's deontologies that aren't necessarily Kant's. For instance, a lot of Christian thought is itself deontological, where people will make an argument, what's the right thing to do? Well, the right thing to do is, say, revealed in the Bible. And so the Bible tells me what the right thing to do is. And so if I do what the Bible says, then I'm doing the right thing. And there the moral law sort of comes from sort of a divine gift. Perhaps. But Kant will try to say that you can know the moral law purely from your own reason. But here's one of these issues related to this too. So Kant says that you can figure it out through your reason, and we're not going to get into all that. But what if you don't care about the consequences and you're just following the moral law? Here's a big problem. You can't be happy. For Kant, if you truly just try to follow the moral law, with no real care for the consequences, then you're in no way necessarily going to become happy at all. You're not going to necessarily have a good, enjoyable life because you are moral and you're excellent. Maybe you will, maybe you won't, but being happy doesn't even factor into things. And so for Kant, it's more about just trying to be worthy of being happy as opposed to actually being happy. Now, I think Aristotle, to a large extent, kind of deals with a lot of these problems. Of course, for Aristotle, he's not going to try to reduce anything to just the consequences or just the intention, but he's going to say, you need to be the kind of person who can make the best kind of judgments. someone who does what's right and not just what seems beneficial under these circumstances. So it seems to have good intentions in the right moral law. But this virtuous person is also someone who's excellent at what they do, and perhaps someone who does, in fact, have these kind of good consequences over the course of their actions. So in many ways, Aristotle's ethics seems to be superior, at least in terms of its outcome. Of course, what's the downside to Aristotle? What is it to say just to become an excellent person? This isn't any type of terribly useful rational principle, except to say, hey, you've got a lot of hard work, and man, wouldn't it have been better if you were raised well so that you could have better judgment? You can't just tell someone to